What if Ned Stark raised Daenerys and Viserys in Winterfell? Not by choice. Ned Stark had enough secrets. He had Jon in the nursery and a wife who had extended every grace she possessed and was watching it stretch. And bringing 2 Targaryen children into his household was the kind of thing that made a man lie awake calculating odds. But what if someone died? What if Sir Willem Darry, who had sailed 2 children out of a burning dynasty and kept them alive in a house in Braavos on nothing but loyalty and the last of his strength, died 2 years earlier than he did? What if the network that was supposed to sustain them collapsed, which networks always do eventually, which is why you needed more than one? What if the message that arrived at Winterfell was not from Darry, but from a Braavosi magistrate who had found 2 Westerosi children in a house with a dead old knight and no legal guardian, and wanted to know what to do with them? Ned read that letter and he thought about Lyanna. He thought about Lyanna, and about the promise he'd already made, and about the one he hadn't made, but was looking at him from the parchment. And he thought about what his father would have done, and what his father's father would have done, and what the northernmost truth of the Stark name demanded, which was, you do not leave children in houses with dead knights and no one to protect them. He sent for them, Catelyn's face when they arrived. That's a whole story on its own. This is the larger one. 2 Targaryen children in Winterfell, the last dragons in the world in a northern castle built for ice and stone and the undemonstrative love of hard people. What they became there. What Winterfell became with them in it. And what happened when Robert found out. Winterfell. The arrival. 285 AC. Viserys was 11 and Daenerys was 1. Viserys stepped off the cart in Winterfell's yard and stood in the cold that was a different quality of cold from anything in Braavos, and looked at the castle the way he looked at everything, with the full assessment of a boy who had been told his whole life that he was owed better than whatever was in front of him, and was deciding whether this qualified. The baby in the cart did not have opinions about the castle yet. She was 1 year old. She was wrapped in wool that did not belong to her, and she had silver hair that had become a problem in Braavos, where silver hair on a child meant things that required explaining, and she had violet eyes that she turned on everything with the focused attention of a very young person for whom everything was still new. Ned came out to meet them himself. He had debated sending the steward and decided against it. This was not a steward situation. This was a Lord of the North meeting, 2 children who had nobody. He looked at Viserys. Viserys looked back at him with the specific assessment of a child who has learned to read adults quickly, because adults have always been the variable between safe and not. Ned said, "You're Viserys. Prince Viserys." He said it the way children said corrections they'd been told to make, automatically, without heat. Ned said, "You're welcome in Winterfell, Prince Viserys." He nodded at the baby. "And your sister?" Viserys looked at Ned with the violet eyes and the silver hair and said, "Sir Darry said we had nobody." "Sir Darry is gone," Ned said. "You have us now." Viserys said, "Who are you?" "Ned Stark, Lord of Winterfell." He paused. "My sister was Lyanna." Something shifted in Viserys' face. He had heard the name. He was 11, and he had been told a version of the story that was curated for grief and rage, and the name Lyanna in the north, spoken by a Stark, landed differently than it had in the tellings. He said, "She died." Ned said, "Yes." He said, "My brother loved her." "Yes." A silence. Cold air. The yard around them. Viserys said, "Are you going to keep us because you feel guilty?" Ned said, "I'm going to keep you because you're children and you need somewhere to live." He looked at Viserys steadily. "You can decide later what you want to call it." Viserys looked at him for a long moment. Then he picked up his bag and walked into the castle, which was the decision in physical form, and Ned picked up Daenerys from the cart and carried her in after him. Inside, Catelyn was waiting. Her face was. Ned had seen his wife's face in many situations. He knew the registers of it. This one was the register she used when she had made a decision she didn't entirely agree with, and was committed to it anyway, because she had looked at the thing clearly and found that the decision was still correct, even though she didn't want it to be. She looked at the baby in Ned's arms. She looked at the silver hair and the violet eyes. She reached out. She took Daenerys. She said, "Come inside, child. You're cold." Winterfell, the first year, 285 to 286 AC. Viserys did not adjust easily. This was not surprising. He was 11 years old, and he had been told his whole conscious life that he was a prince in exile, and that this was a temporary condition, and that the world owed him the correction of it. And now he was in a castle in the north, with people who were not his people, in a climate that was not his climate, and nobody was treating him like a prince. Ned didn't treat him like a prince. Ned treated him like a boy who lived in his house. This was the specific conflict of the first year. Viserys wanted acknowledgement of what he was. Ned was prepared to acknowledge it. He was a Targaryen, the son of a king, with a claim. But acknowledgement was different from special treatment, and Winterfell did not do special treatment. Winterfell did. You eat when the household eats. You train when the household trains. You show up when you're supposed to show up, and you carry your weight. Robb was 3. Jon was 1. They were not competition, and they were not companions yet. There was too much age between Viserys and them for them to be anything to each other in those first years. Theon was not there yet. Viserys was alone in the specific way of someone who has been dropped into a world that functions without them, and is trying to determine their function in it. He found it by accident. He found Daenerys. Not found her physically. She was always somewhere in the household, being managed by nurses and the domestic apparatus that Catelyn ran with the efficiency of a woman who had grown up at Riverrun and understood that households were machines requiring maintenance. He found her in the sense of, she started walking, and she walked toward him specifically. He did not know what to do with this at first. She was 14 months old, and she walked directly toward her brother every time she was put down, and grabbed his trouser leg and looked up at him with the violet eyes that were his eyes in a smaller face. He picked her up. He didn't know why. He just picked her up. He carried her around the castle that afternoon. Old Nan saw this and said nothing. Catelyn saw it from the upper gallery and said nothing. Ned heard about it from Catelyn that evening and said, "Good." Catelyn said, "She's going to follow him everywhere." Ned said, "I know." She said, "He doesn't know how to handle that." Ned said, "He'll learn." He said it with the patient certainty of a man who has been watching children figure things out for long enough to know that the figuring happens when you leave space for it. Catelyn looked at him. She said, "She has her mother's eyes." Ned said, "Rhaella's eyes." "Yes." She said, "She's a beautiful child." He said, "Yes." She said very quietly, "I'm not going to pretend it doesn't complicate things." He said, "I know." She said, "But I'm going to manage it." He said, "I know that too." She looked at him with the full complex regard of a woman who had been asked to carry more than she agreed to and was carrying it anyway, and wanted him to know she knew the weight of it. He met her gaze. "Thank you," he said. He meant all of it. Winterfell. Viserys. 287 to 290 AC. Ser Rodrik started training Viserys at 13. He did it because Ned asked him to, and because Ser Rodrik was a man who trained anyone who showed up in his yard with the basic physical prerequisites and a willingness to work. He did not ask about bloodlines or titles. He asked, "Can you hold a stance? And can you take a correction without sulking? And are you going to be here tomorrow? Viserys could hold a stance. He had difficulties with the correction part in the first month. Not because he was incapable of being corrected. He was actually intelligent enough to recognize when a correction was accurate. But he had been told for 11 years that he was exceptional. And the specific cruelty of that particular lie is what it does to a person when they encounter a world that doesn't confirm it. Every correction landed on the place where exceptional was supposed to be, and found instead the soft, unprotected tissue underneath. Rodrik was patient. He had been patient with difficult students for 30 years, and patience was his primary tool. But it was Robb who sorted it. Robb was 6 and had been in the training yard since he was 4 and had the natural authority of someone who has been doing something for a while and doesn't think about it. He was sparring with a practice sword one afternoon when Viserys arrived in the yard with the expression he wore when he was about to say something corrective about the positioning of the training equipment. Robb said, without looking up, "Your feet are wrong." Viserys stopped. "What?" "Your feet. When you stand." Robb finished his form, looked at him. "You stand like you're waiting to be given something. You need to stand like you're ready to take it." Viserys stared at him. He was 13. Robb was 6. He said, "My father says stance is the first thing. Everything else comes from it." Robb held out a practice sword. "Show me yours." It was such a direct, guileless challenge that Viserys found himself unable to locate his refusal. He took the sword. He stood. Robb studied his stance with 6-year-old seriousness. He said, "Better, but your weight is still back." He came over and pushed Viserys' shoulder forward, which was an extraordinarily familiar thing for a 6-year-old to do to a 13-year-old Targaryen prince, and Viserys let him. His weight shifted forward. Robb stepped back and looked at the result. He said, "That's it." Viserys stood in the corrected stance. It felt different. "Better." He said, "Your father taught you that." Robb said, "And old Nan says it too. She says, 'Stand like you mean to be standing here.'" Viserys looked at the 6-year-old. He said, "How long have you been training?" "Since I could walk," Robb said. He raised his sword. Again. They trained until the light failed. From that afternoon, something shifted in Viserys. Not completely. He was 13, and the formation of himself was still very much in progress. But the specific performing royalty posture that had been his armor began, incrementally, to be replaced by something else. Something he was building himself rather than inheriting. Ned noticed. He noticed everything. Ned Stark. He noticed the way you notice things when you were a man whose primary skill was patience and observation. He said to Catelyn that evening, "Robb sorted out Viserys' stance today." Catelyn said, "Robb is 6. Ned said, "I know." She said, "How did a 6-year-old sort out a 13-year-old's stance?" Ned said, "He treated him like a person instead of a problem." Catelyn looked at their son across the Great Hall, who was currently arguing with Jon about whether wolves could swim, and she thought, yes, that's exactly what he did. Winterfell, Daenerys, 288 to 292 AC. Daenerys grew up between two worlds and navigated both with the instinctive skill of someone who has never known a world without the negotiation. She was a Targaryen in a Stark household. She had silver hair and violet eyes in a castle of brown and grey. She was brought to the Sept for religious instruction and also to the Godswood, because Winterfell was a northern household and the old gods were present, and she was curious. And curiosity was never discouraged there. She sat by the pool in the Godswood when she was 5 and asked old Nan who the face in the tree was. Old Nan said, "The old gods. They've been here since before the first men." Daenerys said, "Do they know me?" Old Nan said, "They know everything that's been in this castle." She sat by the pool for a long time. She asked Ned later who her gods were. He sat with her in the Godswood. She had developed a habit of finding him there in the evenings, and he had developed a habit of being findable in the evenings, and neither of them acknowledged this arrangement explicitly. And he said, "Your family worshipped the gods of Valyria. Some of them. Others followed the seven. Some followed whatever gods seemed right to them at the time." She said, "Which is the right one?" He said, "I don't know. I follow the old gods because my father did, and his father did, and I find them honest somehow. They don't ask for anything except witness." She looked at the pool. She said, "I like it here." He said, "The gods would. The quiet in it." She looked at the face in the tree. "It feels old." He said, "It is old." She said, "Older than the Targaryens?" He said, "Much older." She sat with this for a moment. She said, "My brother says our family is the most important family that ever was." Ned chose his words. He said, "Your family was the most powerful family for a long time. That's different from the most important." She said, "What's the difference?" He said, "Power is what you can force people to do. Importance is what they do because they believe it's right." She turned to look at him. She was 5 and she had the violet eyes that were starting to develop the specific focused quality they would have for the rest of her life. She said, "Which were they?" He said, "Both, at different times. As most families are." She thought about this. She said, "Which are we?" He said, "You are what you choose to be." "That hasn't been decided yet." She looked at the Godswood pool. She said, "I'm going to be important." He said, "I think you might be." She said, "Not powerful, important." He said, "Yes, that's the one worth being." Winterfell. The children, 291 AC. By the time Daenerys was 7, there were 7 children in Winterfell. Robb and Jon at the oldest. Daenerys and Viserys in the middle. Sansa just behind. Then Arya and Bran, still small. It was a full household in the way that households with many children are full. Never entirely quiet. Never entirely still. The specific living noise of young people figuring out who they were in relation to each other. The relationships that formed were not the relationships anyone would have predicted. Viserys and Robb trained together. This was the longest-standing alliance in the household's second generation. 2 boys who had found each other in a yard and had been pushing each other since. Viserys was the better swordsman by 16, which surprised Sir Roderick and which Robb received with the specific good nature of someone whose pride was in the household rather than in himself. He told his father, "Viserys is better than me now." Ned said, "I know." Robb said, "Good. He works harder than anyone in the yard." Ned looked at his son and thought, "That is exactly right." Daenerys and Jon were a different kind of pairing. They were the same age. Jon was a year older, but close enough. And they had found each other in the library at ages 6 and 7 with the specific recognition of 2 people who were both more interested in the histories than the other children were. Jon's interest was in battles. Daenerys' interest was in everything around the battles, the courts, the decisions, the long chains of cause and effect that turned into wars. Old Nan told them stories. This was how it always went in Winterfell. Old Nan at the center of a circle of children. The stories that were not quite the same as the histories in the books. Older and stranger and more honest about what things had cost. She told them about the long night. Jon always listened to this one with the particular attention he gave things he found important. Daenerys asked the most questions. She always asked the most questions about everything. It was her primary mode of being in the world. She said, "How did they stop it?" Old Nan said, "The hero and the sword and the great cold, child. Fire against the dark." She said, "What kind of fire?" "Dragon fire, some say." Daenerys went still. She said, "Targaryen fire." Old Nan looked at her. "The dragons were real, child." "Older than any name," Daenerys said. "Are there still dragons?" "No," Old Nan said. Then, "Not anymore." Daenerys was quiet for a long time. The other children moved on to a different story. She stayed in the stillness of the one they'd left. Jon said beside her, quietly, "You're thinking about something." She said, "The eggs," he said. "What eggs?" She said, "Our house had dragon eggs. 3 of them. When the dynasty fell, they went—" She stopped. She was 7, and she didn't know where they'd gone. "Somewhere. They're somewhere." Jon said, "Does your brother know?" She said, "He knows everything about the old dynasty. He talks about it constantly." She paused. She said, "Maybe I should ask him." Budgie Winterfell, Theon, 290 AC. Theon Greyjoy arrived at Winterfell when Daenerys was 6. He came as a ward, which was the polite word for what he was, which was a hostage, a piece of the Greyjoy peace, a 9-year-old deposited in a northern castle to ensure his father behaved. He knew what he was. He'd been told, and even if he hadn't been told, the way his father had looked at him on the dock was the look of a man placing something in storage rather than saying goodbye to someone he loved. He arrived in the yard. He stood in the yard with 2 bags and looked at Winterfell with the expression of someone cataloguing everything and deciding whether any of it was worth them. Daenerys was in the yard. She was 6, which meant she was everywhere in the castle at any given time, with the focused, roaming quality of a child who is interested in everything. She looked at Theon with the violet eyes and said, "You're the new one." He said, "I'm Theon Greyjoy." She said, "I know. They told us you were coming." She tilted her head. "I'm Daenerys." He said, "I know what you are." She said, "What am I?" He said, "A Targaryen." He said it with the knowledge of a 9-year-old who had been taught to know what Targaryens were and what the word meant politically. She said, "Yes." She didn't flinch from it. She never flinched from it. "And you're an Ironborn." "Yes." She said, "That means we're both here because of something we didn't choose." He stared at her. She said, "Lord Stark explained it to me when I asked why I lived here instead of somewhere else." He said, "Sometimes people end up in places because of things before them. The place doesn't have to be wrong just because the reasons were complicated." Theon said, "That's easy to say when you're not a hostage." She said, "I'm not a hostage. You're right." She paused. "But I was a baby in Braavos with no one, and then I was here with Lord Stark." "Both things are true." He looked at her. He said, "You're 6." She said, "Yes." She picked up one of his bags. "Come on, I'll show you where old Nan keeps the good food." He followed a 6-year-old Targaryen princess through Winterfell to old Nan's kitchen, carrying one bag while she carried the other. He stayed for 9 years. He was difficult for most of them. He performed Ironborn pride and performed it loudly and at inconvenient moments, and was regularly wrong about things he was certain of. But he stayed. He trained with Robb and Viserys. He argued with Jon. He irritated Sansa and was irrefutable evidence for Arya's theory that boys were mostly pointless. And once a year or so, when he was being particularly difficult, Daenerys would find him somewhere and say, "You're here. That's enough. Stop performing and just be here." He never thanked her for this. She never required it. Winterfell. Viserys and Daenerys, 292 AC. The conversation about the eggs happened in the stable, not because the stable was the right place for it, but because Viserys had been spending time in the stable since he learned to ride, and Daenerys had been spending time wherever Viserys was since she could walk, and conversations that happened in the stable had the particular quality of conversations between siblings who were doing something while they talked, which was their natural mode. He was currying a horse. She was sitting on a stall door watching him. She said, "Old Nan says the dragons were real." He said, "Of course they were real." She said, "She says the long night was ended by dragonfire." The histories say that too. Our family ended the long night. That's what the fire was for. He kept working. The dragons and the Targaryens together. She said, "And the eggs? What happened to the eggs?" He stopped. He turned. She had his full attention in a way she'd had it before. She always had it, eventually, because she was the one person in his life who asked the right questions at the right moments. He said, "There were 3. When the dynasty fell, they were in the treasury at Dragonstone. And now," he said, "I don't know." He said it honestly, which was not his default mode on subjects related to the dynasty. He usually had a position on everything about the dynasty. On this, he had genuine uncertainty. Darry mentioned them once, before he died. He said they'd been taken somewhere safe. She said, "Safe where?" He said, "He died before he could tell me." They looked at each other. She said, "We should find out." He said, "How?" She said, "Ask Lord Stark. He knows everything about what happened in the last year of the war." Viserys' expression. He had complicated feelings about asking Ned for anything. The specific complication of someone who had received a great deal and was not entirely comfortable with the debt. He managed it most of the time by not examining it. Asking Ned about the dynasty was examining it. He said, "He might not know." She said, "Then he'll say he doesn't know. That's fine too." She looked at him. She said, "Vis, we live here. We're safe here. We can ask questions." He said, "I know that." She said, "Do you? Because you still..." She stopped. She was 8. She had the instinct for the thing she wanted to say, but not quite the vocabulary. "You still hold yourself like you're about to have to leave." He looked at her. He said, "I grew up ready to leave." She said, "I know." She looked at the horse. "I grew up here." He said, "That's different." She said, "Yes." She looked at him with the violet eyes. "Ask him." "I'll ask him if you want. But we should know." He said, "We'll ask together." Winterfell Ned the answer. 292 AC. Ned knew about the eggs. He had known for years, in the careful way he managed dangerous information. Filed, noted, not acted upon, until acting was either necessary or invited. He told them this when they came to him. They came together, which he had expected. They always came to important things together, the two of them, even though their approaches were different. Daenerys asked. Viserys watched. He said, "The eggs were moved before the fall of Dragonstone. Someone in the household took them. I have reason to believe, they ended up in storage in the Citadel's lower vaults. Not displayed, archived." He looked at them. Stone eggs that have been cold for a century. The Maesters catalogued them as geological specimens. They do not know what they are. Daenerys said, "They're warm." Ned looked at her. She said, "Dragon eggs are warm, Old Nan says. The histories say." He said, "The eggs are cold. Have been cold since the last dragon died," she said. "How do you know they're still cold?" He said, "I don't know for certain." He paused. "I know they exist. I have a contact at the Citadel who confirmed their location. What they are now is..." He stopped. "The last dragon died 150 years ago." Daenerys said, "Does that mean the eggs are dead?" He said, "I don't know." The honest answer. Ned Stark's honest answer. which she had always been able to distinguish from the managed one. She said, "Can we see them?" He said, "Not yet." He looked at them both. "Not while Robert is king, and while King's Landing has the specific interest in your family that it has." He paused. "When the moment is right. I'll find the moment." Viserys said, "You're protecting us." Ned said, "Yes." Viserys said, "Why?" Ned said, "Because you're children in my household, and protecting the children in my household is what I do." Viserys held his gaze. He was 17, and he had spent 17 years learning to read the subtext in adult statements. He said, "There's more." Ned said, "Yes." "My sister's mother died. Lyanna." He said it carefully. "You feel..." "I feel that the cost of what happened was very high, and the bill was paid by people who didn't deserve to pay it." Ned said it plainly. "That includes your family. That includes your parents and your brothers and you and Daenerys." He looked at them. "I can't fix that. I can make sure the next part is better." Daenerys said, "That's enough." Ned looked at her. She said, "That's enough reason. We don't need more than that." Viserys said nothing, but he looked at Ned with something that had shifted slightly from its previous configuration, something in the specific armor of his expression that had found over 17 years of a man doing exactly what he'd said he'd do, a gap where the armor was no longer necessary. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. Winterfell, Jon and Daenerys, 295 AC. Jon found out what he was when he was 12. Not from Ned. He'd been trying for 2 years, asking in the oblique way of someone who suspects the direct question will produce the managed answer, and he had been correct about that. Ned gave him the managed answer every time, which was, "You are my blood, and I love you, and there are things I'll tell you when you're ready." He found out from Daenerys. She hadn't planned to tell him. She had been piecing it together herself for a year. The grey eyes that matched nobody in the Stark line, the way Ned looked at him when he thought no one was watching, the specific quality of Ned's silence when Jon's name came up in conversations about the rebellion. She was 11 and she had been sitting with the picture for a year, and she made the mistake of being in the library with Jon on a rainy afternoon when he was reading the accounts of the Tower of Joy for the 3rd time. She said before she had fully decided to say it, "She was your mother." He put the book down. He looked at her. She said, "Lyanna Stark was your mother. I think I've been certain for about 4 months." She looked at the table. "I should have let Lord Stark tell you." He said nothing. She said, "I'm sorry." He said, "Who's my father?" She looked at him. She said, "My brother, Rhaegar." She said it quietly, not as an accusation, not as a claim, just the fact of it. The room was very quiet. Jon looked at the book, at the Tower of Joy accounts. He had been reading them for a reason he hadn't quite named, drawn to them with the specific pull of information that is close to you before you know why. He said, "Rhaegar Targaryen." She said, "Yes." He said, "That makes us aunt and nephew." She said it with the specific Targaryen composure that she deployed when things were at their most complicated. "By blood," he said. "By blood." She said, "Yes." A long pause. He said, "And Lord Stark has been protecting you your whole life, the way he's been protecting me and Viserys." She paused. "Probably more. Your claim would supersede Viserys's. Your claim supersedes almost everyone's." He said, "I don't want a claim." She said, "I know." She looked at him. "Neither do I." A pause. "That might be the most Stark thing about both of us." He looked at her. The girl he'd been reading beside since they were 6 and 7, who asked questions he hadn't thought of, and who had always known more than she said, and who was telling him the most important thing he'd ever been told, with the specific directness that was her primary mode. He said, Are you afraid of it? What you are? She said. Sometimes. Honest. My father burned people alive. My family ended in fire. She paused. But I grew up here, and what I am here is what I am. He said. A Stark, she said. A Stark-raised Targaryen who sits in the Godswood too much. She almost smiled. And you're a Targaryen who everyone thinks is a Stark bastard and who is going to have to figure out which parts to tell who. He said. I have to talk to him. She said. Yes. He said. Tonight. She said. Yes. She paused. Jon? He loves you. That's not going to change because of what I just told you. It's been true your whole life. The secret is because he loves you, not in spite of it. Jon looked at the book. He said, I know. He sounded like someone who understood it in their head and was waiting for it to reach somewhere deeper. She said, I'll come with you if you want. He said, No. A beat. Thank you. He went to find Ned. King's Landing. Robert finds out. 297 AC. Robert found out the way Robert found out things he wasn't supposed to know, which was through the specific alchemy of wine and a boastful servant who had been at Winterfell and had mentioned in a tavern in King's Landing that Lord Stark's household included 2 silver-haired children with violet eyes. Varys had the report on Robert's desk before the servant had finished his second cup. Robert read it. He was very still for a long time. Then he called for Ned. Ned was in the city. He'd come south for a council matter and had planned to be back north within the fortnight. He had not planned to have this conversation yet. He had been managing the timing of this conversation for 13 years. He walked into Robert's solar and Robert said, Close the door. Ned closed the door. Robert said, The children? Ned said, Yes. You've had them at Winterfell for 13 years. Yes. Aerys's children. He said it with the weight of a man who had made a war on that name and everything it represented. Rhaella's children, Ned said. Their mother wasn't the one who burned people. Robert stood. He walked to the window. He had the specific contained energy of a man managing an enormous feeling by keeping his body in motion. He said, Do you know what this looks like? Ned said, Yes. Harboring. Children, Ned said. I'm harboring children. An infant and an 11-year-old who had nobody. They're Targaryens. They're a girl and a boy who grew up in Winterfell. Daenerys was 1-year-old when she arrived. She's never known anything else. Robert turned. The boy has a claim. Viserys knows he has a claim. He's also 17 years old and hasn't done anything with it except spend 4 years training in my yard. He's a good swordsman. That's not. I know it's not the relevant point. Ned kept his voice level. He had rehearsed this, and he was doing it without the rehearsal showing, which was a skill he'd been building for 13 years. The relevant point is what you're going to do about it. Robert looked at him. Because if the answer is what I'm afraid it is, Ned said, then you and I are going to have a conversation we've been avoiding for 15 years. They're Targaryens, Robert said again. They're the last of a dynasty I ended. If they live, then they live, Ned said. And what they do with their lives is what determines whether that's a problem. Robert stared at him. Ned said, I have watched these children grow up for 13 years, Robert. I have watched Viserys become someone who would follow Robb Stark into a burning building. I have watched Daenerys sit in my Godswood and ask questions about justice that would embarrass most lords 3 times her age. He paused. They are not their father. They never were, Robert said. Their blood. Your blood includes your grandfather, and your grandfather burned the Targaryen fleet. Your blood includes ancestors who did things I won't name in polite company. Blood is not character. A long silence. The fire. Robert said, "The throne." Ned said, "Viserys has not once in 13 years expressed a desire to take anything from anyone. He knows what his family was. He knows what the rebellion was. He lives with a Stark who lived through it." He held Robert's gaze. "He is not his father. He is also not going to be. The man he's becoming will not burn the world for a throne he was promised." Robert said, "How can you be certain?" Ned said, "Because I raised him." He said it with the flat certainty that was the most northern thing about him. "The same way I'm certain about Rob. The same way I'm certain about Jon. You learn what people are by watching them over years in the ordinary moments. I've had years. I've had ordinary moments." He paused. "I am certain." Robert looked at him. Then he said, "I want to meet them." Ned said, "I know." He said, "Not as a king meeting claimants. As..." He stopped. "I want to understand what you built up there." Ned said, "Come to Winterfell." Robert said, "The South needs." "The South will survive a fortnight without you. It always does." He looked at his oldest friend. "Come north. Meet them. Make your decision from something real, rather than from a tavern report." Robert said nothing for a moment. He said, "If I come north and I decide they're a threat, then you tell me. To my face. And we have a conversation I've been ready to have for 13 years. Ned held his gaze. "But come north first." Robert looked at the window. He said, "I need time." Ned said, "Take a month. I'll be in the north." He went to the door. "Robert, I have never lied to you about anything that mattered." Robert said, "I know." "Then believe me when I tell you this is not a threat. These are people." He left. Winterfell, Ned tells them, 297 AC. He told them the night he got back. He told Viserys first, alone, in the solar, late, with the fire and no one else. He told him that Robert knew and what Robert had said and what the next month would look like. Viserys listened. He was 17 now, which was a different 17 from the boy who had arrived 11 years ago. But the capacity for stillness when something large had hit him was the same. He sat with it for a long time. He said, "He wants to come north." "Yes. To decide what to do with us. To see what he decides when he's looking at something real." Ned looked at him. "You are not what he expects." Viserys said, "What does he expect?" "Aerys. In a smaller body." He paused. "He's going to encounter someone who has been training in my yard for 4 years and who knows more about Stark honor than most of my own bannermen." Viserys said, "I'm not a Stark." Ned said, "No. You're a Targaryen who grew up at Winterfell. That's different from both and better than either separately." He held his gaze. "You have your family's fire and my household's sense of what to do with it." A silence. Viserys said, "And if he decides we're a threat?" Ned said, "Then I deal with that." He said it without drama. "You are in my household. That means something." Viserys said, "Even against the king." Ned said, "I've been Ned Stark my whole life. That means something too." Then he told Daenerys. She was harder to predict than Viserys, which was a thing Ned had understood about her since she was 3 years old. Viserys' reactions were explosive and then processed. Daenerys' reactions were quiet and then permanent. She listened to all of it without expression. When he finished, she said, "He's afraid of us." Ned said, "He's afraid of what you represent." She said, "What do we represent?" He said, "The dynasty he ended. The possibility that ending it wasn't final." She said, "We don't want the dynasty back." Ned said, "You haven't said what you want." She looked at the godswood through the window. The dark of it. The old god's in it. She said, I want the eggs. He said, Daenerys? I know. That's not the answer to the question. She looked at him. I know what I'm supposed to want. I know what Viserys was told to want. I know what the stories say about the last Targaryens and what the right ending is supposed to be. She paused. I don't want any of that. He said, What do you want? She said, I want to do something that matters, not reclaim the throne, not restore the dynasty. Something that, when people look back at it, they'll say it was worth doing. She paused. I grew up here. I know what you think governing means. Not power over people. Something else. He said, Yes. She said, The Night's Watch reports. He went still. She said, I've been reading them. In the library. For 2 years. She looked at him. You know about this? I've been reading them too, he said. They're real. Yes, she said. The eggs and the wall. I've been thinking about those two things together for 2 years. She looked at him with the focused violet eyes. If the eggs could hatch, if they could be warm again, if the dragons could come back. That hasn't happened in 150 years. I know. She held his gaze. But I've been warm to them my whole life. Every time I go to the Citadel's records, every time I read about them, I feel something. She pressed a hand to her sternum. Here, something warm, like recognition. Ned looked at her. He said, Is that? I don't know what it is. She said it, honestly. I know it doesn't feel like nothing. He sat with this. He said, Robert comes in a month. She said, I know. He said, one thing at a time. She said, Yes. She looked at the godswood. But eventually, all the things. Winterfell. Robert arrives. 297 AC. He came alone. Or nearly. He brought 20 men and Sir Barristan and left the rest of the court's apparatus in the south, which was itself a statement about what he expected this to be. He rode through Winterfell's gate, and Ned was there, and the household was there, and Viserys and Daenerys were there, standing beside Robb and Jon with the specific arrangement of a family that had been assembled over years and knew how to stand together. Robert looked at them from his horse. He looked at the silver hair. He got off his horse. He looked at Viserys. Viserys looked back. They were almost the same height. Robert was enormous, but Viserys had his father's height and his mother's bearing and the specific posture of someone who had spent 4 years training with Sir Roderick and could hold a line. Robert said, You look like your father. Viserys said, I've been told. Robert said, That's not meant as a compliment. Viserys said, I know. A beat. I don't look like my father. I look like my family's colouring, which my father happened to share. He held Robert's gaze. My father burned people alive. I train in Lord Stark's yard. Those are different things. Robert stared at him. He said, You're not afraid of me. Viserys said, Should I be? I killed your brother. Viserys said, At the Trident, in battle. My brother was armoured and armed and choosing to fight. He paused. That's not the same as burning a man in the throne room. Robert looked at him. He looked at Daenerys. She was 13, and she stood beside her brother with the calm of someone who has been told this moment was coming and has thought about it more than the moment required. She said, You loved her. He looked at her. She said, Lyanna, you loved her. She paused. I grew up knowing her name. Lord Stark doesn't talk about her often, but when he does. She stopped. She mattered. She mattered to him, and she mattered to you, and what happened to her was wrong. Robert said, Your brother. Rhaegar made choices I can't defend. I didn't know him. What I know is that a woman died, and people who loved her couldn't stop it, and the grief from that was enormous and real. She looked at him. I'm not asking you to forget that. I'm asking you to... She stopped. She was 13, and she was searching for the adult word. Look at what's actually here. Robert looked at her. He said quietly, You're not what I expected. She said, I know. He said, Neither is your brother. She said, I know that too. He looked at Ned. Ned looked back with the steady, stark gaze that had been waiting for this moment and was ready to hold it as long as required. Robert said, I need a drink. Ned said, Come inside. They went inside. Winterfell. Robert and Ned. That night. The great hall went quiet after the evening meal. The children went to their chambers. Catelyn went to the solar with a measured expression that communicated, I'll give you tonight. Handle it well. Ned and Robert sat with the fire. Robert drank. He said, The boy. Ned said, Viserys. He's not what I expected. He said it the same way he'd said it in the yard, but from inside, with the fire, it had a different weight. He stopped. He thinks before he speaks. Did you notice that? The boy thinks before he speaks. He didn't always. Ned looked at the fire. When he arrived, he had a speech ready for every situation, about what he was owed and what had been taken. He'd been rehearsing it for years. What changed? Rob told him his feet were wrong in the training yard. Ned almost smiled. He was 6. He corrected a 13-year-old Targaryen prince's stance because he was the one who knew more about standing correctly. He paused. Viserys let him. That was the beginning. Robert was quiet. He said, The girl. Ned said, Daenerys. She said, Lyanna mattered. He looked at his cup. She said it like... He stopped. Not to wound me. Not to use it. She said it because she believed it was important for me to know, that she understood it. She has always been able to read what people need to hear and say it without using it against them. Ned looked at the fire. That's a rare quality, Robert said. Where did she get it? Ned said, I don't know. She had it from the beginning. He paused. She grew up in the Godswood, asking questions about what things were for, what power was for, what families were for. He looked at Robert. She spent more time in that Godswood than any of my own children. Robert was quiet. He said, Jon Arryn. Ned said, What about him? He told me once, years ago, that the problem with Aerys wasn't the madness. The madness was a symptom. The problem was that no one around him was willing to tell him the truth. He looked at his cup. He said, Find people who will tell you the truth and keep them close. Ned said, He was right. You've been telling me the truth my whole life. He looked at Ned. About this. Ned said, Yes. You've had these children in your castle for 13 years. You've been telling me the truth about them for 1 hour. I've been protecting them for 13 years. He held Robert's gaze. Now you've met them. The protection takes a different form. Robert said, What do you want from me? Ned said, I want you to let them be what they are. Not Targaryens waiting to be a problem. People who grew up in the north and who... He stopped. He thought about what Daenerys had said, about the wall and the eggs and the thing she felt in her sternum. Robert, I'm going to tell you something, and I need you to not drink more before you hear it. Robert set down his cup. Ned told him about the reports. The Night's Watch reports. The cold. The dead. The pattern he'd been watching build for 3 years. Robert listened. Ned said, "The Targaryens ended the long night. Whatever that required, the fire, the specific quality of it, that runs in Daenerys' blood, and I believe she knows it. She's been reading the reports on her own for 2 years, without me asking her to." Robert stared at him. He said, "You think the dragons?" "I think the eggs exist, and I think they've been cold for 150 years, and I think the person who makes them warm again is possibly a 13-year-old girl in my Godswood who has been warm to them her whole life without knowing what that means." He paused. "I could be wrong. I am frequently less mystical than this conversation requires, but I am not wrong about the watch reports." Robert said, "The dead?" "Yes." "Walking?" "Yes." Robert looked at the fire. He said, "If Aerys had known this." "He might have had the capacity to respond to it," Ned said. "Or he might have burned everything trying to." He paused. "The difference is what's in that Godswood." A long silence. Robert said, "Tell me what you need." "The eggs, the Citadel, 298 AC. Getting the eggs out of the Citadel was Tyrion's project. He had not been directly asked. He had heard about the eggs through a chain of conversation that ran Ned to Robert, to a raven to King's Landing, to the small council, to Tyrion, who extracted the relevant information from the surrounding administrative content, the way he extracted everything relevant, which was by reading everything quickly and keeping the important pieces. He wrote to Ned. He said, "I understand there are 3 objects at the Citadel catalogued as geological specimens in the Deep Archive that are not geological specimens. I have contacts at the Citadel who owe me a significant number of favors and who are not in the habit of asking what they are actually moving. If you want them moved, I can move them. What I would like to know is, what are we actually doing with them once they're moved? Because if the answer is what I think it is, I have strong opinions about the logistics," Ned wrote back. Tyrion arrived at Winterfell 3 weeks later with 3 objects wrapped in black wool in a chest that he was carrying personally, which was how he carried anything he found genuinely irreplaceable. He put the chest in Ned's solar. He looked at Ned. He said, "Before we open this, the girl," Ned said. "Daenerys. She's 13. Yes. And she has been. How do you know she's warm to them?" "She told me." Ned paused. "She told me she feels something when she reads about them. Something that started here." He put his hand to his chest. Tyrion said, "That's an extremely non-Lannister kind of evidence." Ned said, "I know." Tyrion said, "And you believe it." Ned said, "I've watched this child for 13 years. She does not invent things. She also does not speak carelessly about the things she feels." He met Tyrion's eyes. When she says she feels something, she feels something. Tyrion looked at the chest. He said, "Well, let's find out." He opened the chest. 3 eggs, each one the size of a large melon. One pale cream and gold at the tip. One a deep green with bronze overtones. One a vivid violet black that caught the light and held it. They were cold. Or they looked cold. They had the appearance of stone, which was what the Citadel had always catalogued them as. The surface texture of something that had been still for a very long time. Tyrion said, "The histories say warm." Ned said, "The histories say many things." He went to find Daenerys. She came back with him. She stopped in the doorway of the solar and looked at the 3 eggs on the table and went very still. Tyrion watched her from the corner. He watched the thing that happened on her face. Not the performance of recognition. The actual thing. She walked to the table. She reached out. She put both hands on the violet black egg. The room was silent. She held it. Tyrion watched her hands. He said quietly to Ned, "Her hands." The warmth was visible. Not dramatically, not fire, not magic in the stories. The subtle visual shift of heat haze between a warm thing and cold air. Very faint. But there. Daenerys said, to the egg, "I know you." She said it as if she was continuing a conversation she'd been having with something that had always been there. Tyrion looked at Ned. Ned looked at Tyrion. Tyrion said, "Well, the hatching. Winterfell, 298 AC. The first egg cracked on a Wednesday. Not dramatically. Not with fire or ceremony or any of the theatre the old accounts described. The violet black egg that Daenerys had been sleeping with beside her bed for 3 months developed a hairline crack along the top seam while she was reading, and she looked up from her book because the warmth of it changed quality in a way she could feel without looking. She put the book down. She sat on the floor with it. She held it against her chest the way she'd been doing since the day Tyrion brought it, with the patience of someone who is not waiting for a specific moment, but is simply present for whatever moment comes. The crack widened. It took 4 hours. Jon found her at the 2-hour mark and sat beside her without being asked, which was his way. He never asked permission for the things that were simply correct to do. He read while she held the egg, and neither of them spoke much. Viserys came at the 3-hour mark. He sat on the other side of her. He had the expression of a man who had been told his whole life that dragons were his family's birthright, and was discovering that birthright looked like his sister sitting on the floor in patient communion with a rock that was no longer quite a rock. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. At the 4-hour mark, the egg opened. Not shattered. Opened along the seams, as if the thing inside had always known where the seams were and was simply using them correctly. The dragon inside was the color of twilight. Violet black scales, gold at the edges, eyes that opened and found Daenerys before they found anything else, and did not leave her. She made a sound that was not language. It answered her. Not in language. In the specific way of very young things that have just arrived in the world and are doing the primary work of finding out who they are for. It was the size of a cat. It was the most alive thing in the room. Viserys said, in a voice that was very unlike his usual voice, "Gods!" Jon said nothing. He had the grey eyes fixed on the dragon with the focused attention he gave things that changed the understanding of what was possible. Daenerys held the dragon against her chest. She looked at her brother. She said, "The others." He looked at the remaining 2 eggs. He said, "Do you want—" She said, "Hold one. Put your hands on it and hold it the way I did." He said, "I'm not." "Try." She looked at him. Try." He reached out. He picked up the cream and gold egg. He held it. He stood there for a long time. He said, "Nothing." She said, "Keep holding it." He held it. A minute passed. 2. He said, "It's—" He stopped. "Is it warmer?" She said, "Yes." He looked at his hands around the egg. He looked at Daenerys. He said, "Oh, the yard. Robb and Viserys, the night before the eggs hatched. They were in the yard in the dark. Not training. The training was done and the yard was empty, and they were just there. The way they ended up in the yard sometimes when the castle was too full of indoor things. They sat on the fence at the yard's edge with the cold and the specific northern dark that was not menacing, just honest about what it was. Daenerys's egg had cracked that morning. She was inside with it. Jon was with her. Robb said, "Do you think it'll be tonight?" Viserys said, "I don't know." "She thinks it'll be tonight." Robb said, "Then it'll be tonight." Viserys looked at him. Robb said, "She's been right about it the whole time. The warmth, the timing, all of it." He paused. I've stopped arguing with her about things she knows from inside herself. Viserys said, When did that start? Robb said, When I was about 9. She told me the Karstark hunting dispute was going to end badly for the Karstarks before my father had even heard about it. She said she could see how the pieces fit. She was 9. He paused. I've been paying attention to her since. Viserys said, She told me once, when we were small, that I held myself like I was about to have to leave. Were you? I don't know if I was consciously preparing to leave. I think I was, not trusting that I was allowed to stay. Robb said, You were allowed to stay. Viserys said, I know that now. He looked at the dark yard. For years, I was waiting for your father to decide we'd become inconvenient, to send us back south or make us smaller somehow. He never did. Robb said, He doesn't do that. Viserys said, I know. He paused. The first time I understood it, really understood it, was when Robert's men sent the Raven, about the possibility of Robert discovering us. Your father read it at dinner, and he didn't change. He just read it and set it down and passed the bread to Sansa. He paused. He told me after, but at dinner, nothing changed in his face. I watched him. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't calculating. He paused. He was just... Ned Stark, Robb said. Yes. He said it simply. This was who his father was. It didn't require annotation. Viserys said, You're like him. Robb said, I try to be. He said, Not in the external things. You're louder and you move differently. But He looked for the word. The thing he has that makes people trust him. The thing that makes you believe what he says, because you've never caught him saying something false. Robb said, He taught me. Say true things, even the uncomfortable ones. Especially those. He paused. He says it's harder, but cheaper. Comfortable lies cost you eventually. Viserys said, My father. He stopped. He had complicated things to say about Aerys and had gotten better over years at knowing when the complication was worth navigating and when it wasn't. My family was built on the comfortable lie that they were exceptional, that the blood made them right. My father believed it completely, and he shook his head. The lie was the problem, not the power, the lie. Robb said, Yes. Viserys said, I have a dragon. He said it with the wonder that was still in it, 2 weeks after the hatching. I have a dragon, and Daenerys has a dragon. And the blood is real. The power is real. And what I do with it is the part that matters. Robb said, Yes. Viserys said, Your father taught me that. Robb said, He taught me that too. He paused. A little differently. Viserys said, How? Robb said, He taught me by how he holds things. The lordship, the household, the people in it. He looked at the yard. He holds it like it's not his, like it's borrowed temporarily from the people it belongs to. He's keeping it for them. He paused. That's the right way to hold power. Viserys looked at the dark yard, at the castle around them. He said, I'm going to try to hold it that way. Robb said, I know. Viserys said, Even when I don't have anything formal to hold. Robb said, You will. Eventually. He looked at him. You have a dragon. The realm is going to have opinions about that. Viserys said, The realm is going to have to accept some things. Robb said, Some things, yes. He almost smiled. Not everything. They sat in the dark yard. After a while, Robb said, We should go in. It'll probably be soon. Viserys said, Yes. He said, Viserys looked at him. I'm glad you're here. He said it with the specific Robb Stark quality of someone who says direct things simply and means them completely. From the beginning, I'm glad he sent for you. Viserys said, so am I. They went inside. Daenerys' egg hatched 2 hours later, Winterfell after, 298 to 299 AC. Ned told Robert the same night. The raven went south with 3 lines. The eggs hatched. 2 of 3. Both children. Come north when you can. Robert's reply came in 4 days. It said, coming. Don't let anyone else know yet. He arrived in 2 weeks, and he stood in the courtyard and watched Daenerys fly. She was 13, and the dragon was the size of a large dog, and she had been flying in short circuits above the castle for a week with the specific absorbed concentration of someone learning a thing their body recognized before their mind caught up. Robert stood in the courtyard. He looked at the dragon and the girl on the dragon's back and the silver hair against the northern sky. He said to Ned, who was standing beside him, "That's real." Ned said, "Yes," he said. "She's 13. "Yes," he said. "Is the boy?" "His is still hatching. 3 days. Maybe 4. Ned paused. "It's slower. Viserys is older. The bond takes longer when you're not. When you didn't grow up expecting it." Robert watched Daenerys bring the dragon down in the yard. She landed with the easy control of a natural, which was what she was. What the blood made of people when the blood had something to express itself through. She looked at Robert. She was 13, and she'd just been flying a dragon in the northern sky, and she looked at the king of Westeros with the steady eyes of someone who had been told this was coming and was not going to perform anything about it. Robert said, "You're going to make things complicated." Daenerys said, "Probably." He said, "The dragons. People will..." She said, "I know what people will say." She paused. "The Night's Watch reports." "Ned told me." She said, "Then you know why we're here." He looked at her. The king who had killed her family, looking at the last of her family on the ground after flying over a castle in the north with a dragon she'd grown in her hands from a cold stone. He said, "You're not what I expected." She said, "You've said that before." He said, "To your face. This is the second time." He looked at the dragon, who was sitting at her feet and watching Robert with bronze eyes that were already evaluating him. "What do you want?" she said. "To go north, when the time comes." She paused. "There are things in those reports that only fire stops. Lord Stark says fire and Valyrian steel. We have a Valyrian steel sword in this castle, and we have..." She looked at the dragon. "We have fire," Robert said. "You're 13. She said, "The time isn't now. By the time it's now, I'll be older." She said it with the patient certainty of someone who has been building toward a moment for a long time and is not in any hurry about it, because hurry would be the wrong tool for the building. Robert looked at Ned. Ned said nothing. Robert said, "I'll need to think." Daenerys said, "I know." She picked up the dragon, who tolerated being picked up with the dignity of a creature that had decided this was acceptable. "Take your time." She went inside. Robert watched her go. He said to Ned, "She's going to save the realm." Ned said, "She might. With help." Robert said, "And the boy?" Ned said, "Viserys is going to be different from what you expect too." Viserys, the second dragon, 298 AC. The cream and gold egg hatched on the 4th day. Viserys had been holding it for most of those 4 days with the patient grimness of someone who was not entirely comfortable with waiting and had decided that grimness was the correct response to discomfort. When it cracked, he was in the yard, sitting against the wall with the egg in his lap and Robb beside him, because Robb had decided that sitting with Viserys during the vigil was correct and had simply appeared and stayed. They hadn't talked much. Robb said at some point, "Does it feel like anything?" Viserys said, "Warm. Just warm." Robb said, "Is that not enough?" Viserys said, "I don't know what enough feels like for this." Robb said, "I think enough feels like whatever you have." The egg cracked at dusk. The dragon that came out was cream and gold, the color of early morning, smaller than Daenerys's, with green-gold eyes that found Viserys immediately and stayed. Viserys held it. He held it with the hands of someone who has been told all his life that he was owed an inheritance and has just discovered that what he was owed is something he didn't expect. Not a throne, not armies. Something that looked at him from eyes the color of summer grass and made a sound that meant, "I know you." He pressed his forehead against the dragon's head. Robb, beside him, said nothing. He was 17, and he had spent 17 years as a boy told he was a prince in exile, and the dragon was the first thing that had ever told him he was right about something in his blood, rather than in his circumstances. After a while he said, "What's his name?" Robb said, "You'll know it." Viserys sat with the dragon. He said, "Aegon." Robb looked at him. He said, "My brother's name. He died before he was old enough to be anything." He looked at the dragon. "Someone should carry it forward." Robb said, "That's a good reason for a name." Viserys said, "The historians are going to find this confusing." Robb said, "The historians can manage." Viserys almost laughed. It was the most unguarded sound he'd made in 11 years in that castle. Catelyn, what she never said, 298 AC. Catelyn found Ned in the Godswood the night after Viserys' dragon hatched. She had been carrying something for 13 years, with the specific Tully grace of a woman who knew what she had agreed to and honored it even when it cost her. She had not complained about the Targaryen children in the way she had not complained about Jon. She had managed her feelings toward both with the dignity of someone who understood that the children were not the source of what she felt, and that making them the source was a choice she refused to make. She sat beside Ned. She said, "There are 2 dragons in my castle." He said, "Yes." She said, "And the children are—" She stopped. She looked at the pool. "They're happy. Both of them. For the first time since they arrived, I think. Not performing happiness. Actually happy." He said, "Yes." She said, "I'm glad for them." He looked at her. She said, "I'm also—" She stopped again. She was very precise with her words on the things that cost her the most. "I am glad for them, and I am terrified for my children. For all of my children." She looked at him. "Robb is going to follow Viserys north. I know he is. I know what he is, and I know who Viserys is to him. And when the time comes, Robb is going to ride to that wall, and I am going to have to let him." Ned said, "Yes." She said, "And Jon." He said, "Cat." She said, "I know what Jon is to you. I've always known that you love him the way you love the others. I've made peace with that." She paused. "Tell me he's going to be safe." Ned said, "I can't tell you that." She said, "I know you can't." She looked at the pool. "Tell me anyway." He said, "He's going to do what he was built to do, and I'm going to be beside him as much as I can. And you are going to have to trust that what we built here was adequate to what's coming." She said, "Was it?" He looked at the Godswood, at the old gods and the pool and the darkness that was not unfriendly in the way of dark places that have been respected for a long time. He said, "Look at them, all of them, Jon and Robb and Daenerys and Viserys. Look at what they are." She looked at nothing in particular, but she was building the image in her mind. She could see it, the children she'd watched grow. He said, "We built something here. Not what I planned. Not what you planned. Something else. Something that was built by all of them, figuring out who they were together. He looked at her. That's adequate. For whatever comes. She was quiet. She said, Daenerys told Arya today that the gods were older than the Targaryens, and that was why she sat in the Godswood. She paused. Arya is going to quote that for years. Ned said, I know. She said, and Bran asked Viserys whether dragons dreamed. Ned said, what did Viserys say? She said, he said he didn't know, but he was going to find out. A pause. He's been terrible with the younger ones, too impatient. And now he's... She shook her head. He's going to be something, Ned. Ned said, yes. She said, both of them are. He said, yes. She put her hand in his. They sat in the Godswood. The old gods kept their witness. Winterfell, Viserys and Ned, 299 AC. The conversation had been building for years. Viserys had been rehearsing it, not deliberately, in the way he'd rehearsed everything when he first arrived at 11, but naturally, the way you work toward a thing over time until the working toward it becomes the readiness. He was 23. He had spent 12 years in Ned Stark's household. He had a dragon. He was going north in the spring. He went to Ned's solar on an evening in late autumn. Ned looked up when he came in and set down his quill and waited, which was the Ned way. He could read in a face when someone was coming towards something important, and the appropriate response was to clear the space for it. Viserys sat. He said, I'm not going to take the throne. Ned said, I know. Viserys said, I need you to know it's not because you told me not to. It's not because of Robert. He paused. He was looking for the right words in the same way he'd once looked for the right stance, methodically, with patience that had been trained into him by years of being corrected for impatience. It's because I don't want to be what happens when someone takes a throne they were promised. Ned said, Tell me what you mean. He said, I watched my father from the stories. Not my father as a person. I never knew my father as a person. From the stories say, he was promised everything. He was told from birth that the world was arranged in an order and he was at the top of it. He looked at the fire. What that does to a person, the specific thing it does, it removes the choosing. If you're owed everything, you don't choose anything. You just collect what you're owed. Ned said, Yes. I was told the same thing. For 11 years, I was told I was owed the throne. When I got here, he paused. When I got here, nobody cared what I was owed. Robb cared whether my feet were right. Sir Roderick cared whether I showed up. You cared whether I was going to be someone worth having in your household. He looked at Ned. Nobody cared what I was owed. Ned said, No. He said, that was the thing I'd been missing. He looked at his hands. When something matters because you earned it. When Sir Roderick said that's good, the first time he said that's good. That was more than anything I was owed. He paused. I don't want to go back to being owed things. I don't want the throne. Ned said, What do you want? He said, To go north and fight the thing that needs fighting. And then he stopped. He looked at Ned directly. I want to see the South. Eventually. I want to see the parts of the world my family used to rule and decide for myself what I think about them. Ned said, Not to reclaim. He said, To understand. He paused. There's a difference. Ned said, Yes. Viserys said, You taught me that. He said, You taught yourself. I just kept the door open. They sat with the fire. Viserys said after a while, I used to think you kept us because you felt guilty about Lyanna. Ned said, I know. He said, I don't think that anymore. Ned said, What do you think now? He said, I think you kept us because that's who you are." He paused. "And because you looked at two children who had nobody, and you thought, this is what the right thing looks like, even when the right thing is difficult." He looked at Ned. "That's what I want to be." Ned looked at his ward, the boy who had arrived with a bag and a speech about what he was owed, the man who was going to ride north in the spring on a dragon named Aegon with a sword that had been built by hand in the north and an understanding of what things were, for that had been built over 12 years in a god's wood. He said, "You already are," Viserys said. "You have to say that." Ned said, "No, I don't." He said it with the flat northern certainty that meant, this is true and it is not negotiable. "I say what I mean." Viserys looked at him. He said, "I know." He paused. "That's the other thing I learned. The wall. What came next? 300 a sea. 2 years after the hatching, Daenerys rode north. She was 15. The dragon, she had named her Visenya, for the Conqueror's sister, who had been a warrior and whose stories Daenerys had been reading since she was 8, was the size of a large horse and still growing. She rode north with Ned and Viserys and Robb and Jon and the northern host that the Watch reports had been building toward. Not the full force. They were still assembling that, still distributing the dragonglass, still working through the specific logistics of an alliance between the Night's Watch and the realm. But the first force, the vanguard. Mormont met them at Castle Black. He looked at Daenerys. He looked at the dragon that had been circling at altitude during the approach, which had caused the brothers on the battlements to have the specific reactions of men who had been told a dragon was coming and had not fully believed it until they saw it. He said, "Your Grace." She said, "I'm not a Your Grace yet. I'm a Lord's ward from Winterfell with a dragon." He said, "What would you prefer?" She said, "Daenerys is fine." He looked at the dragon. He said, "What does fire do to them?" "The dead," she said, "burns them completely. The accounts say—" "I know the accounts." He looked at her. "I need to know what you know." She said, "I know the accounts, and I know this." She looked up at Visenya circling. "I know that whatever is cold and wrong up there is the opposite of what I have here. I can feel it. The same way I could feel the eggs before they hatched." She paused. "I don't have a better description than that." Mormont said, "That's enough description." He looked at the wall. "We've had a white come to the gate last month, alone." Ned said, "Sent deliberately." "I think so." He looked at Daenerys. "I think whatever is out there knows something is different this year." Daenerys said, "It knows." Mormont and Ned both looked at her. She said, "Whatever commands the dead knows fire is here. I've felt it since we crossed the neck. Something that knows fire is here and is deciding what to do about it." She said it with the flat certainty of someone describing an observed fact rather than making a claim. Mormont looked at Ned. Ned looked at Mormont. Then Ned looked at his ward. He thought about the 1-year-old in the cart and the girl in the godswood asking what things were for, and the letter he'd read from a Braavosi magistrate, and the specific chain of choices and costs that had brought all of them to the wall. He thought, this is what it was for. He said, "Then we don't wait for it to decide." Beyond the wall, the engagement, 300 a sea. They went north on a clear morning in early winter. Ned and Robb and Viserys and Jon, who had the specific quality he always had in situations that required him to be exactly what he was. The grey eyes steady, the sword in the right hand, the wolf at his heel, and the full presence of someone who does not perform preparedness because they actually are prepared. Daenerys rode above. The land north of the wall in winter was the land of the old stories made physical. Not hostile exactly, but not for human beings, not built for them, older than them, and indifferent in the way of things that existed before anyone came along to have feelings about their existence. They found the army of the dead 3 hours north of the gate. Or the army found them. There was a moment when the distinction had been relevant, and then a moment when it stopped being relevant, because the dead were between the tree line and the way back, and the question was only what happened next. Viserys moved left without being told to. He had the dragon, Aegon, the cream and gold, who had been flying circuits high above with Visenya, and he used it the way you used a tool you'd spent 2 years learning, which was with the specific precision of someone whose instinct and knowledge had merged into something that looked effortless and was not. Robb moved right. He had ice, Ned's Valyrian steel, which Ned had given to Robb 2 weeks before, because Robb was the better swordsman, and this was not a moment for paternal sentiment. And he moved through the dead with the momentum of years of training paying out. Jon moved to the center. He always moved to the center. The center was where the pressure was, and Jon Snow had been moving toward pressure since he was old enough to understand that moving away from it was a choice, and the choice had costs. He had Ghost. The direwolf moved with him and through the dead in ways that disrupted the organization of them, the specific quality of a living predator among animated dead, disturbing the animating principle in ways nobody fully understood. But that worked. Ned fought behind them. He watched his children. He watched Robb with ice driving through the flank, and Viserys pulling the army of the dead apart from above, and Jon in the center finding the weight of the line and holding it with pure refusal to move. He watched Daenerys. She had found the Night King. He didn't know how. She hadn't told anyone she knew where to look, had perhaps not known until the moment, had perhaps felt it the way she felt the cold when they crossed the neck, the direction of the wrong thing. The compass of old Valyrian blood pointed at its opposition. She dove. Visenya dove with her. The fire was extraordinary. Not because it was large. It was large. The specific, enormous fire of a dragon at full output. But the extraordinary quality was what happened when it hit the Night King, who moved as the accounts had described, faster than it should have been possible, sideways out of the column of it, but not fast enough. The fire caught the edge. The Night King stopped. The army of the dead stopped with it. Not gradually, all at once, the way they had always moved, in response to the direction of something that was now not directing. The field went still. Daenerys brought Visenya down. She got off the dragon on a field full of things that were stopped moving, and she looked at where the Night King had been, and she stood there for a moment in the specific stillness of someone who has arrived at the end of a very long road. Ned reached her. He put his hand on her shoulder. She said, "Is that it?" He said, "I think so." She said, "I'll know if it isn't." He said, "Yes, I know." She stood in the field. She was 15 years old. She said, "I want to go home." He said, "Yes." He didn't mean south. He didn't mean a throne. He meant the Godswood and the pool and old Nan by the fire. "We'll go home." Winterfell, what happened after? The political aftermath took longer than the battle. It always does. Robert called the lords. He told them what had happened. He told them that the last Targaryens had been raised in Winterfell, that 2 of them had hatched dragons, that one of those dragons had ended the thing beyond the wall, that the Night's Watch had been reporting on for 30 years. He told them that the Night's Watch was to be properly funded going forward, that the dragon glass mining was continuing, that the Valyrian steel production facility that Ned had established was to be maintained. He told them about the succession, that there was a Targaryen with a claim sitting in a castle in the north. He did not say what he was going to do about it. Cersei, who had been the first person to be told and had spent 3 days not reacting before finding the reaction she wanted, said to Tyrion, "He's going to give her something." Tyrion said, "Probably." She said, Not the throne, he said. Not while he's alive, and Joffrey is his heir. She said. She won't take it by force, Tyrion said. She absolutely won't take it by force. She grew up at Winterfell. Taking things by force is the Baratheon tradition, not the Stark one. Cersei looked at him. He said, You've read the reports. She went north because the dead were coming south. She didn't go north to build a claim. He refilled his cup. She doesn't particularly want the throne. That is the most disorienting fact about this entire situation, and I have been unable to stop thinking about it. Cersei said, Everyone wants the throne. Tyrion said, She was raised by Ned Stark. She sat in his godswood for 13 years, asking what things were for. The throne. He thought about how to put it. The throne is where you sit to do the thing that matters. She wants the thing that matters. The sitting part is administrative. Cersei looked at the window. She said, What does she want? Tyrion said, To go home, apparently. Ned told Robert she said that on the field. Cersei said, Winterfell is not going to be enough forever. Tyrion said, No. He paused. But it's enough now. And now is the moment we're in. Robert did not immediately resolve the succession question. He did what Robert did with things that were complicated and real. He let them be complicated and real for a while, before forcing a resolution, which was either wisdom or cowardice, depending on the day, but which in this case was correct because the situation required time to settle before it could be managed. What he did immediately was name Ned his hand officially, which Ned had been informally for years. What he did 3 months after was ride to Winterfell, not for the succession. He didn't come to discuss Daenerys' claim. He came because Arya had sent him a letter. A Stark child sending a raven to the king was unusual enough to be interesting. That said, Lord Stark says you are good at eating. Come north again, the cooks have been practicing. He came because this specific kind of thing was the kind of thing that Robert Baratheon could not resist. He sat at the great hall table and ate and watched the household. He watched Viserys and Robb at the far end in an argument about formation tactics, the argument close and loud, and clearly one they'd been having for years. He watched Jon and Daenerys reading beside the fire, the specific companionable silence of two people who had been reading beside each other for most of their lives. He watched Arya pester Bran about something, and Sansa manage Catelyn's side of the table with the composed skill of someone who had been watching her mother for 10 years and absorbed the useful parts. He watched Ned at the head of the table. He thought, This is what Ned built. He thought, This is what the North produced when you gave it long enough and trusted it enough to produce something. He said across the table to Ned, I made the right call. Ned said, Which one? Robert said, Coming north, 13 years ago, when you showed me the raven. Ned said, You didn't come north 13 years ago. You stayed south and drank. Robert said, You know what I mean. Ned said, You didn't stop it. Robert said, No. Ned said, That's what you mean. Robert looked at the table, at all of it. He said, That's what I mean. Daenerys, the Godswood, 300 AC. She went to the Godswood the morning after Robert arrived. She went before anyone else was awake, which was the habit she'd had since she was 5. The Godswood was hers in the early morning, before the household made its daily claims on everything including the quiet. Visenya came with her. The dragon was too large for the Godswood now, too large in wingspan, though she could move through it with the careful precision she used everywhere since she started growing beyond cat's eyes. She settled herself at the edge of the pool and watched Daenerys sit. Daenerys sat by the pool, the face in the heart tree. She had been looking at this face for 15 years, and it had never changed expression, and she had never expected it to. But she looked at it every morning anyway, because looking at it was the habit of her life, and habits of a lifetime are their own kind of faith. She said to the face. "We did it." The pool reflected the face back at her. She said, "I know you don't answer. I know you just watch." She paused. "I've been thinking about what Lord Stark said when I was 5, that the old gods don't ask for anything except witness." She looked at the pool. "I think I understand that now. The watching is the thing. It doesn't need to change anything to matter." She was quiet. She said, "I don't know what comes next." She said it without anxiety. It was an accurate statement about the future, which was genuinely unknown, and she had learned in 15 years in Winterfell that accurate statements about unknown things were better than comfortable fictions about them. She said, "Viserys wants to go south eventually. He doesn't say it, but I know. He's been north his whole life, and he's starting to want to see the world that isn't north." She said, "I want to stay here. I know I won't always be able to, but I want to stay here." She looked at the face. She said, "I want to be here when Arya does the thing she's going to do, that none of us have predicted yet. I want to be here when Bran figures out whatever it is that Bran is figuring out. I want to be here when Robb has to carry the North the way Lord Stark carries it." She paused. "I want to be here for all of that," she said. "And the wall. There's still work. The Night King is gone. That doesn't mean the work is done. It means the emergency is done. The work is ongoing." She said, "I know what I want to do with my life." She looked at the heart tree. "Not a throne, not a dynasty. The work. The specific ongoing work of keeping the things worth keeping." She said, "I think Lord Stark would say, that's enough." She sat. Visenya made the sound she made when she was content. The low resonance of a creature that has decided where it is where it should be. The old gods watched. They didn't answer. They didn't need to. What if Ned Stark raised Daenerys and Viserys in Winterfell? He raised them the way he raised everything in his care, which was without theatre and without exception. They ate at the table and trained in the yard and asked questions in the library and sat in the godswood until the old gods were as familiar to them as their own blood. He raised a Targaryen girl who grew up knowing that power was not the same thing as importance, that the throne was where you sat to do the thing that mattered, and that the sitting was administrative. He raised a Targaryen boy who arrived performing a prince and left the performance behind in pieces over years, who found in a training yard with a 6-year-old that what you are is more than what you were told you were owed. He raised them alongside Stark children who had the North in their bones, and the North got into the Targaryens the way the North gets into everything it's given long enough to work with. Quietly, permanently, without asking permission. The dragons came back. The dead were stopped. The work continued, as it always does, as it always must. The daily choosing of what to build and who to protect, and what the things you have in your hands are actually for. Daenerys sat by the godswood pool and said, "I know what I want to do with my life." She was 15 years old, and the Night King was ended, and the wall stood. She was going to stay in Winterfell for as long as the staying was possible. And when it wasn't possible anymore, she was going to take everything Winterfell had made of her into whatever came next. The old gods watched. That was enough. Castle Black, the night before, 300 AC. The night before they went north, Ned could not sleep. This was not unusual. He had not been sleeping well since they crossed the neck, since the ranging reports had confirmed what they'd suspected, and the engagement was no longer theoretical. He lay in the bunk in the Castle Black guest quarters, and looked at the ceiling and ran through the plans for the 14th time, and found them adequate, and found that adequate was not the same as sufficient when the thing you were sending people toward was what was beyond the wall. He got up. He walked the battlements. The wall hummed against his boots. He had been here 3 times now, and the humming was no more explicable than the first time, but he had stopped trying to explain it, and had started treating it as information. The wall knew things. The wall communicated them in the only language available to 700 feet of ancient ice. He was standing at the north face when he heard her. Daenerys, below him on the outer parapet, sitting on the battlements in the cold with Visenya's tail wrapped around her feet, which was the dragon's cold weather preference when they weren't flying. He climbed down. He sat beside her. She said without looking at him, "You couldn't sleep either." He said, "No," she said. "Viserys is asleep." "I know. I checked." He paused. "Jon is asleep," she said. "Jon sleeps before everything. It's unnatural," he said. "He's always been able to sleep when he decides to." She said, "A skill," he said. "A northern skill." She looked at the north, the dark of it. Whatever was in the dark. She said, "I'm not afraid." He said, "I know." She said, "I think I should be more afraid than I am." He said, "The fear is there. You've moved it to a place where it's useful rather than stopping." She said, "You do that." He said, "Yes. Catelyn says I do it too much." He paused. "She's probably right." They sat. She said, "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know something." He said, "You don't have to." "Lord Stark." She looked at him with the violet eyes in the dark and the wall at her back and the dragon at her feet. "Let me say it." He stopped. She said, "I was 1 year old. I don't remember Bravos. I don't remember Darry. I don't remember anything before Winterfell. Winterfell is my earliest memory, and my latest, and everything in between." She paused. "Everything I know about what it means to do the right thing when it costs something. Everything I know about looking at a difficult thing honestly. Everything I know about holding things for the people they belong to, rather than treating power as ownership." She stopped. She was 15, and she was not a person who performed emotion, but she was a person who told the truth. And the truth right now was close to the surface. All of it is you, not told to me, shown every day, in the ordinary moments that you didn't know I was watching. He said, "I knew you were watching." She said, "I know you knew." She almost smiled. "You watched me back." He said, "Yes." She said, "Whatever happens tomorrow, I want you to know that." She looked back at the north. "I'm going to be all right. I'm going to come back. And when I come back, I am going to have done the thing I grew up to do. And you are why I was ready to do it." He said nothing for a moment. He put his hand over hers. She leaned slightly into the warmth of it, the way she had since she was small. Just slightly. The minimum necessary acknowledgement of needing something. He said, "Come back." She said, "I will." He said, "Say it like you mean it." She looked at him. She said, "I will come back. I promise." She said it with the flat, north-learned certainty of someone who says what they mean and means what they say. "You taught me to keep promises." He said, "I know." He held her gaze. "That's why I'm asking you to make one." She looked at the north. She said, "Then I make it." Visenya stretched and resettled her tail around them both, which was new. The dragon had always been Daenerys's specifically, had chosen her, had been hers, and the warmth of it was the warmth of a very large and not quite animal thing that had decided a person was family. They sat on the wall in the dark before the day that would decide things. The cold was out there. They were here. That had always been the difference. The third egg, what remained, 300 AC. The third egg never hatched. It sat in Ned's solar, wrapped in the same black wool Tyrion had wrapped it in, on the shelf beside the window where the morning light touched it. not warm to anyone who held it, not cold the way it had been cold before. There was something in it that responded slightly, some ambient quality that was not the nothing it had been in the Citadel's archive. Not enough to hatch. Tyrion wrote about it, 6 months after the battle. He wrote to Ned from King's Landing, where he was doing the things he did, and the letter said, "The third egg interests me. Not as a threat, clearly not a threat. As a question. What does it require that the other two had, and this one doesn't?" Ned wrote back, "The other two had Targaryens who were ready. The third may require someone who hasn't been born yet." Tyrion wrote, "That is either very wise or very concerning, and I can't determine which." Ned wrote, "Most true things are both." The egg stayed on the shelf. Daenerys looked at it sometimes when she visited the Solar. She put her hands on it and held it and felt what was in it. Not nothing, not yet everything. Something in between that was patient in the way the old gods were patient. She said to Ned on one such visit, "It's waiting." He said, "I know," she said, "for someone specific." He said, "Do you know who?" She looked at the egg in her hands. She said, "Someone who hasn't needed it yet." She set it back on the shelf. "But will." Ned looked at the egg. He thought about Bran, who asked whether dragons dreamed. He thought about Arya, who had looked at the egg 3 weeks ago with the considering expression of someone running a calculation. He thought about Rickon, who was too young to be in these thoughts yet, but who was already, even at 3, the most unpredictable person in the castle. He thought, I don't know which of them. He thought, I don't need to know. He thought, the egg will know when the time comes. He left it on the shelf. Ned, Winterfell, after everything, 300 AC. He wrote to Catelyn from Castle Black after the battle and before the ride south. He wrote, we held, we are coming home. He wrote, Daenerys kept her promise. She came back. So did Viserys. So did Robb and Jon and all the ones I sent. He wrote, I am going to tell you a thing I have never been able to say at the right moment because the right moments were always interrupted. 13 years ago, I sent for those children because they were in a house in Braavos with a dead knight and no one, and I could not leave children in a house with a dead knight and no one. He wrote, I also sent for them because of Lyanna, because what happened to her was wrong, and the children who existed at the end of the wrong thing deserved better than the consequences of it. You have always known this, and you have always managed the grace that required, with more than I had any right to ask for. He wrote, what we built in that house, Catelyn, what we built together over those years, that is what came north. That is what held the wall. The children you helped raise, and the household you ran, and the patience you carried when I could not always explain why the things I asked were worth asking. He wrote, that is what I want to say. Thank you for what you built. He wrote, I'm coming home. He folded it. He sealed it. He sent it with the first raven south. Then he went to find the others, Robb and Daenerys and Viserys and Jon, who were in the Castle Black Great Hall, eating the food that the Watch's new supplies made possible, which was considerably better than the food the Watch had eaten for 20 years, and he sat down at the table with them. Daenerys passed him bread without being asked, which she had been doing since she was old enough to reach across a table. Viserys was arguing with Jon about something in the ranging accounts. Robb was listening to both of them with the half-smile of someone who has heard this argument before and knows how it ends. Ned sat. He ate. He looked at his children, the 4 of them, assembled by choice and necessity, and the specific alchemy of a castle in the north that turned whoever it was given enough to work with. He thought, this was the right thing. He had thought that before, many times, in the years when the right thing and the difficult thing were the same thing, and the only available response was to do it anyway. He thought it now in a different register, not as a reassurance but as a confirmation. The evidence was sitting at the table, eating the Watcher's improved bread and arguing about ranging accounts, and the evidence was sufficient. He ate his bread. The wall held outside. The north stretched away in every direction. His children were here. That was enough. That had always been enough. Old Nan. What she always knew. Old Nan had known since the first day, not about the secret specifically, though she had her suspicions about Jon, had them since the boy was old enough to hold a sword, and showed the specific, deliberate quality of someone whose bloodline had been very good at particular things for a very long time. She had the specific, old northern ability to read the thing that was in the room alongside the person, rather than simply the person. What she had known since the first day was this. The girl would be fine. The girl with the silver hair who had come in the cart wrapped in grey wool, who had looked at old Nan with the focused eyes that were already too serious for a baby, and who had reached out and grabbed old Nan's finger and held on. She had held on. Old Nan had looked at Lord Stark's face when he carried the girl into the great hall, and she had looked at the girl, and she had thought, this one knows what she's for. Before she knows anything. Before she knows her name. This one already knows. She had been right. She was right about most things. This was either the advantage of age, or the product of simply having watched more than most people and being willing to say what you saw, which was a rarer combination than it should have been. She told Daenerys stories. She told all the children's stories, but she told Daenerys the true ones, the older ones, the ones that were not polished for children, but were given to them straight and trusted them to take what they could and leave the rest for later. The girl always took more than expected and came back for more. She asked, what was Visenya like? The real one, not the songs. She asked, what did the people of Westeros think when the dragons first came? She asked, what does it mean when something that was gone comes back? Old Nan answered what she could. For the last question, she said, it means the world has need of it again. Daenerys said, how does the world know what it needs? Old Nan said, the world doesn't know. People know. People feel the need, and they do what the need requires, and something comes back. She said, like the Watch reports. Old Nan had been in Winterfell when those reports first started being mentioned by Lord Stark, quietly, at the table, with the specific care of a man who believes something others haven't caught up to yet. She said, like the Watch reports. Daenerys said, Lord Stark believed them from the start. Old Nan said, Lord Stark has always known what was real. She said, because he looks at things honestly. Old Nan said, because he's not afraid of what he sees. Daenerys sat with this. She said, I want to be like that. Old Nan said, you already are. She said it with the flat certainty of someone who had been watching people for a very long time and knew the difference between becoming and being. You've always been like that. You were like that when you were a baby in that cart. Daenerys said, how can you know? Old Nan said, because you held on. She looked at the girl. When you were 1 year old in that cart, you grabbed my finger and held on. A baby that holds on like that knows something. She paused. It knows it's worth holding on. Daenerys was 15 when Old Nan told her this. She was a week from riding north. She had a dragon asleep at the end of the hall. She looked at Old Nan. She said, thank you. Old Nan said, don't thank me. Come back in one piece. She said, I promise, Lord Stark. Old Nan said, then promise me too. She said, I promise. Old Nan said, good. She reached out and patted the girl's hand. Now go. The others are looking for you. She went. Old Nan sat for a while in the hall of Winterfell. She thought, I have been in this castle for 70 years. I have seen many children come through it. I have seen what the castle does to them and what they do to the castle. She thought, this batch was something. She thought, Lord Stark always had good ones. But this batch, the Starks and the Targaryens all together, learning from each other, building something together that neither blood could have built alone. She thought, that was worth the 70 years. She went to find something warm to drink. The castle hummed around her in the way of old places that have been full of living for a very long time, and are full of it still. Arya, what she decided, 300 AC. Arya was 9 when the eggs hatched, and she thought about it for a year, and then she went to Daenerys and said, I want to learn to fly. Daenerys said, you can't. Visenya chose me, and Aegon chose Viserys. Arya said, I know that. She paused. I want to learn what it requires. The way you fly. The connection between you. I want to understand how it works. Daenerys looked at her. She said, why? Arya said, because the third egg is still there. Daenerys went still. Arya said, I looked at it. I held it for a long time. She said it without claiming anything. Without saying it warmed for me or I felt something. She said, I want to understand what I'm looking at. Daenerys said, how do you know it's for you? Arya said, I don't. Maybe it's not. She met her eyes. But if it is, I want to be ready. Daenerys looked at this 9-year-old Stark child with the grey eyes and the fierce, focused quality of someone who had been arriving at things ahead of schedule her whole life. She thought about what old Nan had said. This one knows what it's for. She said, all right, let's start at the beginning. She started teaching Arya. Not flying. Arya was right that the connection was not available yet, that the third egg was waiting for something that hadn't arrived fully. But the understanding, the relationship between a Targaryen and the thing in their blood, the histories of what that relationship had been used for and what it could be used for. Arya was a good student when she was interested. She was very interested. Ned found out about the lessons 3 weeks in and said nothing, which was the most useful thing he could have said, which he knew. The third egg sat on the shelf. It would keep sitting there, warm in a way it hadn't been in the citadel, patient in the way of very old things. Arya kept learning. What the learning built was its own story, for another time. The beginning of it was a 9-year-old with grey eyes standing in front of a 15-year-old with violet ones saying, I want to understand what I'm looking at. That was the right question. In Winterfell, the right questions always got answered.